I really think that if things had been reversed and Brock was raw but had a bigger upside, and Trey were the guy who had the lower upside, but man, his timeline was he's doing it right now. He doesn't need 6 months or a year to develop, and there weren't unknowns. I think that the Niners would be going with the play. I think it's more about Brock's timeline really jives with their timeline because they don't feel like there's not going to be like when I think Jed or I think Kyle and John are
Here's
thinking.
My issue with that, though, Larry.
I think they're thinking about his last. They're thinking about the conversation at the end of the year with Jed, and the conversation is it's not going to be okay to be like, well, we lost this year because of the quarterback development. That's not going to be.
No. And why did Shanahan's dad get fired? Right, 2 years after he went to the AFC
RG3?
Championship game and beat no in Denver. He went to the AFC Championship game and beat New England at home with Jake Plummer. I think who was the running back at the time? It would have been one of Tatum Bell, Mike Bell, one of those guys ran for 1,000
Mike
yards
Anderson
that year.
was.
Maybe it was Mike Anderson. He had a host of them, right? Tatum Bell, Mike Bell, Clinton Portis, Landis Gary. All those guys ran for 1,000 yards after TD. But he got fired because they had, I think, 2 losing seasons in a row with Cutler, I want to say. And yes, they kind of developed Cutler, but he was out of there because of the 2 losing seasons because Cutler became a franchise quarterback becomes the most important person in the franchise, right? Because that investment, he becomes more important. His importance superseded Mike Shanahan's importance. And I think similarly, when the 49ers trade that much, use that many assets to get Trey Lance, I don't think they can do this game where it's like, oh, well, we thought he was going to be this, but the timeline's not really working. But look, we made 2 straight NFC Championship games, so therefore, don't worry about us. We're going to just stick him in a competition with Sam Darnold, and if he loses it, don't blame us. Like, see, he lost the competition to Sam Darnold. They traded that much up. They have a responsibility to try and develop that quarterback and take care of that. And I do think that in some ways, and while what you're saying about the situation is probably what they're thinking, and I understand it, like, I agree with it too, Larry, because I've mentioned the same things. I don't think it's a right way to look at it because I think that this competition and all of this is a distraction. It's that's why I call it fugazi. It's us going back and forth about Trey Lance versus Sam Darnold without missing on the fact that the Niners traded 3 first-round picks to get a quarterback. He's played 4 games in his career, and he's in a competition with a guy who's washed out on 2 different teams already. Like, what is that? That's bad. That doesn't happen. That shouldn't happen.
Well, what it is, I think
we're not talking about Shanahan, right? We're not talking about Shanahan. Instead, we're talking about these quarterbacks, and he's not making a decision on them.
I think it's about you draft, and then it's ultimately it just comes down to it's not about your draft position. I mean, there's guys that they drafted high, and they cut Trey Sermon, and they have Elijah Mitchell on the team.
Right.
They have Jordan Mason, and they cut Trey Sermon.
Right.
They may go this summer with Ronald Awatt and cut Ty Davis Price.
I think it's different with the quarterback, though, because what happens with the quarterback, I think there's also a dynamic to it, right? Like when you trade that much for example, let me say this, right? When you trade that much up for Trey Lance, right? Let's say the Niners had started Trey Lance in 2021 and they went 6-10 or whatever, and he looked like pretty good. And then they started him in 2022. And again, they went like 9-8 and he looked pretty good. You know who would be out of there for only having 1 winning season in 7 years or 2? And that would be the Super Bowl year in 2019. You know who would be out?
I don't
know who would, they wouldn't. I think if they had started Trey Lance and that was the situation because of the investment in Trey Lance and because it's the quarterback, I think that Trey Lance would have gotten another coach before Shanahan would have gotten a different quarterback. And I think in some ways they're protecting themselves by not going through this process with him because it's almost as if they're suppressing his importance. And I feel like they've done that from the beginning when they didn't feature him in the face of the state of the franchise, Larry. The state of the franchise, you don't feature the 3rd overall pick that you use 3 first-round picks to acquire, the inaugural state of the franchise with him as a part of it, and you don't feature him? That's the quarterback. That's the guy you want to market around, right? Is it not? Isn't that the guy every football team wants? They want the quarterback so they can market him.
I think you're not giving Shanahan enough. You're not giving Shanahan enough credit, because the reality is there's scar tissue from Tom Sula and Kelly. They went 7-25 in those 2 years, and then 6-10 under Kyle, 4-12 when Jimmy got hurt, 13-3 Super Bowl appearance, 6-10 in the injured year, 10-7, now 13-4, 3 NFC title games in the last 4 seasons. I think that Kyle Shanahan, because of how bad Chip Kelly and Jim Tom Sula were, has always had a far longer leash with ownership than the media makes it sound. I don't think Shanahan would have been out.
I'm
not saying it's right or wrong. I don't believe it.
But if they got to a situation where it was, because what I'm describing, right? If he started, and I know we're getting deep into the hypotheticals and the speculation, but let's just sit there for a second. If we talked about 2021 and 2022 being losing seasons, Larry, he's had one winning season in his career as a head coach. Where does that leave him? I don't know if that one Super Bowl is enough equity at that point for him coming off of 2 losing seasons. But either way, he didn't. He went to back-to-back NFC Championship games, and he coached that. It was because of his coaching that they got there, so he deserves 100% credit for that. But I do think the direction of the organization is a little bit questionable here, because when you invest that much in a quarterback, Larry, I do think there is a responsibility in what you're trying to do for that quarterback and what you're trying to turn that quarterback into. And I feel like the Niners are halfway into that, and they just decided that they don't want to do it anymore because they found a different quarterback. And that might be true and that might be right, but I don't like the fact that they're covering up that conversation with this quarterback competition. And that's why I think it's a little bit fugazi.
I think the commitment was not to Trey, the individual. The commitment was to quarterback on a rookie deal, and quarterback who can make plays off schedule.
That first part changed,
and Brock checks both those boxes.
That first part changed, though, because they tried to acquire Matthew Stafford. They tried to acquire Deshaun Watson. They kept saying they needed a starting quarterback, right? What was Shanahan's line in the presser before the draft? We need a starting quarterback. That's why we moved up. We felt we needed a starting quarterback. Hey, Kyle, will Jimmy be back on the roster? I don't know if anyone will be alive, man. Then right after the draft, it was, well, it's actually really hard for people to beat out Jimmy, so we expect Jimmy to start and all of that. There was a 180 there with it. And I do think that the rookie deal became more prevalent as the Deebo Samuels earned their second contract, as the Brandon Ayuk's. Right, it got better, and then they found out, well, the 7th-round rookies, we can actually win with him, and he's the cheapest quarterback ever. I do think there was a pivot and fluidity in the plan, too. I don't think it's only that. But I don't think that when they moved up, it was with the sole purpose of rookie quarterback, because I think that's disingenuous, because they were looking to get a quarterback that they felt they could win a Super Bowl with. And I think at the time, the feeling was that they couldn't win a Super Bowl with one Jimmy Garoppolo, which was proven again last year and might have been proven again 2 years ago, and might have been proven again last year if he stayed healthy.
I mean, it's just really hard to find a franchise quarterback, and they didn't feel like Jimmy was that for a variety of reasons: availability, health, inconsistency of play, some boneheaded decisions. Mm-hmm. They knew he was better than what they had, but they also didn't think he was good enough. And then I think as they developed their roster, and then they started doing this roster comparison side by side.
Right,
you can play with the cap, but you can only play with it for so long if you have a quarterback making $25 or $30 million a year, as opposed to Brock Purdy, who doesn't even count against the cap because he's not one of, he's
right. Exactly. Right. The 7th-round pick. It's the ultimate if you don't have Mahomes, Burrow. I will say this, Larry, I think there's a league-wide pivot. I don't think it's just the Niners. I think in 2021, I think they might have felt like to compete with Mahomes, you need a quarterback like Mahomes. But I think in 2023, what people are realizing is that it's really hard to get Mahomes or Allen or Herbert or Burrow. Like, those guys are like truly special. And so if you don't have that guy, instead of trying to play the game of outscoring them, why not try and play this game where a quarterback is cheap? We're going to manage your quarterback, and we're going to have a really good team around him. I think that's what Atlanta's doing right now. where they're trying to build a really good team and seeing what they have with cheap Desmond Ridder rather than getting the cheap Jimmy or going the kind of medium expensive route of like a Garoppolo or a Derek Carr that has no chance against Mahomes anyway. Same thing I think Washington is doing. Washington has a very talented football team. Like, I don't know why they're taking this risk with Sam Howell, but I kind of understand it too, because that risk will reap more rewards because of the value and the price versus getting Jimmy Garoppolo, who what he is, but what he is very average. You know what I mean? And so I think there is a league-wide shift in this direction.
If you look at the last 30 years in the NFL, what you're going to find is there's one non-franchise quarterback that wins the Super Bowl every decade. And I think they wanted more than a 10% chance at the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really if you don't have a top-tier quarterback, you got about a 10% chance at the Super Bowl. And that's what the last 30 years has indicated. Nick Foles did it. Dilfer did it.
Right.
There's a couple guys who did it, but I mean, basically, Joe Flacco. It's basically
Brad
one
Johnson,
guy every
Trent
10
Dilfer.
years. Every 10 years. I mean, you can look it up. Every 10 years, there's been one guy who wasn't really a Hall of Famer who got it done. So, but I ultimately at this point, I think that now it's just about they've got this football team, and if you went with an expensive quarterback, you wouldn't have Ayuk, you wouldn't have Bosa, you probably wouldn't have Warner. And so they've gone this route. I think they were really committed to getting a rookie quarterback. And then they were never really committed to taking the bumps and the bruises that go along often with developing a rookie quarterback.
Right.
And so, it's like you can fall in love with ideas.
A step further, Larry. I think it goes a step further. I don't think it was just that. I think when you talked about the locker room part of it, when we were debating the first part of this conversation, right, with Purdy and Lance, you said they wouldn't want to upset the locker room because right now it feels like Purdy's clearly captured the locker room after what he did in those 8 games last year, right? Is that a fair assessment?
I think the locker room likes both guys, but is sold on Brock as the leader and as the number one quarterback.
Okay, right. So
right now.
Put it like that. So they're sold on him right now as the number one quarterback, right? I think that similarly the locker room was sold on Jimmy Garoppolo. I really think they were sold on Jimmy Garoppolo. I think they played for Jimmy Garoppolo. They really believed in Jimmy Garoppolo. They believed in how Jimmy Garoppolo handled himself. Now, I've argued with a couple of 49ers directly about Jimmy Garoppolo. They love Jimmy Garoppolo. They're former 49ers, but they love Jimmy Garoppolo. So I've had those arguments with them, but they love him. They thought he was great. And I think that what they didn't read when they traded up for a quarterback was how it disrespected Jimmy and how the locker room felt with Jimmy. And it felt like from the moment they got Trey, they were always trying to draw the line in between being fair to both quarterbacks when they were already way more invested in one by using 3 first-round picks to acquire him rather than the other. And I think politics plays into when I asked the question of Larry, why didn't they feature the number 3 overall pick in the state of the franchise? Have you ever heard of a business doing that? Like, Krug, you are an owner of a business. You just invested $80 million into a brand new part. And the first time you have to show your customers that brand new part, you don't show that part. You show all the old stuff. Who does that? Who does that?
Well, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between
because there was they wanted to keep this lot. They didn't want to piss off the locker room by outshining Jimmy, which then gets to the 2 quarterback system. What happened with that? All of that. I think the disconnect was they never read where their locker room and where their team was when they made the move up. I think there was a disconnect between the team and the coaching staff on what they believe, what their belief of where and what their capabilities of winning with Jimmy Garoppolo was. And I felt like there was a turning point in that 2021 season when they moved for Trey, where I felt like the coaching staff could have put their foot down and said, this is who we're going with, and you're going to have to deal with it. And I don't think they did that. And I think that's why, even after Trey played his best football to date, right, the second half against Houston, the best football he's played, they trotted back out, injured Jimmy Garoppolo with needing a thumb surgery and needing a shoulder surgery that week 17, or week 18 at the Rams to win the must-win game, right? So, I think there was a belief there, and I don't think they read that properly.
Well, they felt like Jimmy gave him a better chance to win. They felt like Jimmy gave him a better chance to win.
Well,
I mean, there's no question about that.
I get it.
I mean, they didn't know.
I do get it.
They didn't know. They
Yeah.
didn't know. I mean, they drafted a guy hoping that he would give them a better chance to win. But I really believe that they put Jimmy back out there at that point because they felt like Jimmy gave him the better chance to win.
You don't think there was a locker room disconnect? I feel like when we go back to the tension that the reporters were saying existed after Lance lost the week 1 when Jimmy came back, they had to have that 16-person meeting, right, to make sure that everybody was in line with the idea that Trey was the guy, even though Jimmy was there. The quotes from Mike Silver that were direct quotes from members of the team, right? This is 49ers football. I won't say we're a better team, but you can say we're a better team. Like, does that not show a disconnect when people are saying this about
the shows an evaluation that they didn't think it shows an evaluation that they didn't think that Trey was ready. They didn't feel like Trey was ready to play. I mean, just by the way, by the plays they called in the Arizona game, it showed how they utilized him.
Mm-hmm.
Heck, I mean, outside of the Houston game, they never really used him in a way that I thought showed that. Well, they didn't use him the way they used the other quarterbacks, and Shanahan doesn't even describe him in the same way as the other quarterbacks. Even this offseason, he called him a dual threat quarterback.
Yeah, exactly. And he said Sam and Brock are similar, right? And I think people are saying, well, I think somebody in the comments is pointing out, I'm not saying there was a disconnect with the team. I'm saying there's a disconnect on how the team viewed the quarterback position and where it was and how the coaching staff viewed it. Because they made a monumental move. They made a monumental move to get Trey Lance. You don't make that move if you have the belief in Jimmy Garoppolo that the 49ers players had in Jimmy Garoppolo.
Well, and the funny thing about that whole 49er players, where was this, hue and cry for Jimmy Garoppolo after Jimmy got hurt and Brock stepped in? Because Brock stepped in, outplayed Jimmy, and in a matter of weeks, basically, by the end of the year, nobody was even asking the question, is Jimmy coming back? It was like they didn't want Jimmy. They didn't want Jimmy to come back. The players didn't even want Jimmy to come back.
Right.
Jimmy had some good relationships with Kittle and Juszczyk and others. And when I would ask them late last year about Brock, a lot of times they had carved out little trite answers like, "I'll say it again." Well, why do you have to say it again? Because you don't want to be overly complimentary about Brock Purdy because you're deep down Jimmy's buddy. And Kittle could have built a whole second level on his house based on the elevation that Brock's play took his game to, but he didn't want to be overly complimentary. So he kind of, he said complimentary things because how could you not? He didn't lose, but they weren't going to be overly glowing, and neither was Juszczyk. He wasn't overly glowing.